Morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We're continuing our theme of 80s, classics, I'm not quite sure, but 80s tunes to welcome us to the morning. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us again. It's great to see so many of you, and today I think we've got a really interesting agenda in our anatomy webinars series, and actually reflecting on it. One of the things which I think that we have not been covering in the last few weeks is actually a really detailed understanding of diversity and inclusion. And I think this is becoming more important as is going to be revealed during today's conversation. And it's kind of like this is a catch up for all of us, just in case we have not been keeping this top of the agenda during what has been an incredibly complicated and chaotic period over the last 6 months. So I'm really excited this morning to welcome Olivia Sinfield, who is an Associate Director of Osborne Clarke, the law firm, who have offices globally. And so, Olivia, welcome. Can you introduce
Hi.
Yes, morning. Tell us a bit about yourself, what you do, and what Osborne Clarke do, and why you are focusing today on diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much, Tom, and good morning, everybody. I have to say it's quite hard following Katrina and the waves, but I'll give it my best shot. So, as Tom said, I'm Olivia. I'm an Associate Director in Osborne Clarke's London employment team. I've been practicing employment law now, advising HR for just short of 20 years. I'm joining this session from rural Lincolnshire. And to address the elephant in the room, I'm calling in from not a Scandinavian sauna, but this is my garden office. To tell you a little bit about OC, so we're a full service international law firm. We've very much grown and developed alongside the tech industry. So we were one of the first law firms to have a foothold and an office out in Silicon Valley. And we very much now focus on the sectors which are driving and thriving on innovation, key ones for us being financial services and tech, media and comms. Sort of on a personal front at the moment and over the last couple of months, I've been working really closely with clients who have been facing and are still facing really fast-paced change on multiple fronts, and helping them through that disruption and the opportunities that brings. And diversity and inclusion has kind of been one of the areas that we've been advising on as part of that challenge of change, as well as a law firm being committed to embracing diversity ourselves. And just on a personal front, Tom, I think I tick the box on a number of OC's diversity fronts. So I'm female, I'm an agile worker. I've worked agilely for the last 4 years, so long before COVID. I'm a part-time worker, I'm an adoptive mum, and despite my non-accent now, I'm also a Geordie, and don't hold it against me, but a Newcastle United supporter. So that's me.
Well, actually, you've touched on something there straight away, which is, can you actually set the scene for us in terms of what has the impact of COVID been on D&I? Has there been an impact which is specific to diversity and inclusion? Are there things which have happened which kind of concerned you or not concerned you or improved or otherwise? So what's really the scene in terms of what's changed in this area since COVID started?
Yeah, of course. I think, it's a really good starting point to sort of have a flavour of where we're at. So, before all this happened, we were seeing real progress. We weren't quite there, but real progress in respect of diversity and inclusion. And it was very much moving up business agendas. And there was much more of a growing awareness of that correlation between strong business performance and particularly innovation and creativity, with how diverse and inclusive a business is. So that was the before. Lockdown came, and of course our worlds all changed, and I think it's fair to say that initially D&I took a bit of a hit, and this sort of more active focus on D&I, it slipped down the priority list because businesses understandably had that full state of change, a whole heap of other things to think about, and was on their agendas. But for a time D&I was really at risk. Then there was a bit of a change in the tide, and we sort of moved forward at a fairly rapid pace on kind of two key fronts. First of all, we've seen a much stronger focus across the board and by necessity really on workforce inclusion overall, as most businesses have had to obviously adapt to working from home and the challenges that brings. So that was one change. The other one is we've experienced kind of heightened business empathy with managers and leaders showing a greater understanding and having to show a greater understanding of employees' personal circumstances, and that's involved having to consider the needs and sort of concerns of all these different groups. So where we're at is it's still very much on the radar, but in a different kind of guise to how it was before. Whether that's for better or for worse, you'll probably have to have me back in a year's time and we can talk about it again. But I think definitely, now there is real recognition that diversity and inclusion, particularly the I part, particularly the inclusion piece, is absolutely critical for business recovery, and what we're talking about with clients, the kind of reimagination of what our workforces and workplaces are going to be like going forwards.
I think that's really interesting. I think that's true. I mean, the opportunity to be inclusive has in some ways increased. So what I'm seeing is a lot of people who previously might not have been included in certain conversations in businesses are now included. And what I mean is, for example, a general meeting happening on a monthly basis. In the past, it was hard in a physical environment for everybody from all of their regions, etc., to attend those kind of meetings. Whereas what I'm seeing now is that because everything's done online, actually, people's voices are being included, which previously would have almost been excluded, not by intent, but by the physicality of the meeting. I was wondering, do you have any comments or thoughts on that? Is that something you're...
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree with that, Tom. And I think, there was a real sort of almost like a rush on that inclusion virtually when we first went into lockdown, when it was very much, this is all new and different. And businesses really felt the need and value in reaching out across the board to all sectors of the workforce. I think the important piece and the challenge going forwards is how they sustain and maintain that. And there is some concern from some quarters that maybe there is a dropping off of people's involvement and buy-in to that. So it's now's the kind of critical time where businesses have to be proactive and think, how can we build upon those better increased lines of communication that we've established, like you've said, during lockdown, and take that further.
Right. And I mean, yes, one question I've got is really, in your view or in your experience, how has the pandemic affected different groups of employees? So is there a way of grouping employees into different impacts? And from a legal perspective, what are your thoughts on that? Yes.
Yeah. How long have you got, Tom? So, COVID without and lockdown, without a doubt, it's had huge but disproportionate impacts on different groups, different sections of our workforce. And, it's summed up by, I think you used it in the tagline for this session, that we've been in it together, but we haven't been in it equally. And it's really important that businesses going forwards are really aware of these experiences and build this into their decision making and forward planning. So just kind of touching on a few, you've got a number of different groups who've been affected. So first of all, we'll start with women, which, to some degrees, COVID's been a setback for gender equality, because women have been in the eye of the storm, if you like. Kind of two key things there. First of all, women and minority groups are, of course, overrepresented in the industries where we've seen the highest layoff rates, so particularly retail, hospitality, the service industries. we've also seen that whilst there has been more of a sharing of the load at home, so my husband, for example, did the school run this morning, statistically working mothers still absorb a disproportionate amount of childcare and homeschooling responsibilities, and that's continuing now as schools are, you know, sending bubbles home. And the result of this is it's very real and it is tangible. So we saw this year an increase in the average gender pay gap. And actually the figures there are probably conservative because of course that was cancelled this year. So it was around about 48% of businesses that actually voluntarily reported. So the gap is probably bigger than we think it is. And we're seeing in terms of the claims that are coming through the system that without a doubt, it's more women who have lost their jobs, who've quit, who've been furloughed or switched to less demanding roles, with a particular impact on senior women, Black women and working mothers. So that's just one group. Then for example, the BAME community, they faced unique challenges, of course, from COVID. I think they're statistically 5 times more likely to have experienced the death of a young one. Factored in, layered upon that, the toll of the sort of recent events of racial injustice. Within OC, we had a mental health panel this week, and a Black colleague of mine, she talked really, really powerfully about the trauma for her and her friends of seeing the events unfold over the summer, and about the rise in the number of cases of PTSD in the BAME community. Carers, you know, they've been hit hard because of having to juggle work and home commitments, often without having their usual support systems in place. And we've seen, sorry, Tom.
What's interesting to me is that, Olivia, you're talking about real evidence of a falling back in businesses, and obviously not every business, but overall in ways which are actually tangible and you can measure.
Absolutely. And if you look at all different groups, they've all, you know, the impact is different for each, but it is real, it is tangible. So you know, people with disabilities or pre-existing health conditions where they've faced a huge challenge working from home. And, you know, it's interesting, if you look at reasonable adjustment requests for disabled people, that was a huge problem. I don't think people really realised the extent of it before we went into lockdown, where last year nearly 70% of reasonable adjustment requests were rejected. And those are requests for adjustments in the workplace, let alone requests for adjustments at home. So many people within that group are, you know, finding themselves without having the right equipment or support for whilst they're working remotely.
It's really interesting what you're describing about it. We're all in it together, and a single approach, etc. Because I think if you took it up a level or several levels to the kind of the national response and indeed the international response directly to COVID, we're seeing a fracturing of that consensus.
Yeah.
So whereas I think during the first lockdown in England, the popularity of that measure and people's willingness to conform and do their absolute best has now somewhat eroded. And as we see the second set of measures coming in, which are, you know, differentiating between population groups, etc., and asking different things of different groups, we're seeing a lot more resistance and a lot less goodwill. Now, I imagine that that is something which is also true in firms.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, in the last 6 months, most businesses have done what they need to do and put the top priorities of keeping their business running, keeping the cash flow working, etc., keeping their teams and relying on the goodwill of team members and staff. But in the end, if unfairness is creeping in, if practices which are not supporting our team members are appearing, presumably this will come home to roost in the end. So I wonder whether we're at a turning point where we need to reapply our focus in these areas and actually think about them tangibly, because what we thought was going to be a month or two is turning into 6 months and looks like it might turn into a further 6 months, etc. So presumably, whilst we were okay to not put specific measures in practice during the first 6 months, that's becoming increasingly less so. And we should all be expecting in the new year, people who feel aggrieved, people who are aggrieved by various lack of formal practices and informal practices in our firm, actually are going to start turning these into formal complaints potentially.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's going to matter. So is that something which you are expecting to occur, Olivia? And what should we be putting in place and starting to think about so that we have these things covered off in our firms?
Yeah, it is definitely something which I don't think we're just expecting to see starting to occur. It's starting to occur now, where that I think we're past that honeymoon period of where employees were happy to kind of just put up and manage to get through what people were hoping was maybe a short-term period into, as you described, the reality of, no, we are in this for the long term. So that and as far as businesses are concerned, we've gone through that stage of return to work planning, and then that was turned on its head with the change of approach from the government. So the focus is now very much on how are we going to work towards, in most cases, this kind of more of a hybrid working model, and thinking through loads of different factors, but a key one being how does that impact on diversity and inclusion, and what different measures do we need to put in place in the workforce in order to progress that and make sure that we don't fall backwards in respect of D&I.
And what sort of things should we be thinking about, Olivia?
There's a whole host of things, really. So looking at, I think some of the best practice examples we've seen is probably the best starting point. And we've seen some really real drivers of change emerging on the D&I front over recent months. I think that the biggest change over the summer, which will have a real positive effect on D&I, maybe more in the long term, has been the knock-on effect on leadership and senior management, because we've seen leadership having to adapt and develop more nuanced skills. So whilst there's still that kind of place for the more old-fashioned power style of command and control, we now realise, or people are growing to realise, that empathy, listening, appreciation and support are really important. So we need that sort of blend of hard and soft skills. So where we're seeing the greatest success stories is where, leaders and managers have really got to grips and acknowledged that, and that where there's a real top-down board level approach to diversity and inclusion. It's absolutely critical that there has to be involvement and accountability from business leaders, and that this just isn't just seen as something which sits with HR, albeit HR have an extremely important part to play in this going forwards. And we've seen some fantastic individual examples here. So leaders being involved in individual mentoring programs. We've heard of businesses, and actually we're doing it within OC, of leaders and senior managers sharing their own stories of personal struggle. And it's so powerful where our leaders set themselves up as being role models. Even down to just, sort of small steps forward. So I was talking to one client who was telling us that they receive now weekly video updates from their managing partner, not just about all the bigger picture stuff like how the business is performing, but also with messaging around, for example, you need to, the phrase they used was, you need to be leaving loudly when you go on holiday or when you switch off on an evening. So really kind of driving home messages about, we are concerned about the mental health implications of COVID and working from home.
Yes, very interesting. I'm going to pick up on that in a second. Just for the audience, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to move on to any questions which you want to raise. So down at the bottom of the box, you'll see there's a questioning area. So pop in your questions there, and Olivia and I will attempt to address those later on in the conversation. What I am interested in as well is that for all those, or rather making oneself visible and being included in a business is something which we are all skilled at, and some people are more skilled at than others.
Yeah.
And in a physical environment, we knew who those people were, and we worked on that management, and we drove making sure that the right people were involved, etc. Now, it's much harder so those people on online activities, working from home, etc. There are people who are very good at making sure they get what they need, that they are capable of making sure their voice is heard, and all this stuff. And there are those people who are less good.
Yeah.
Now, thus far, we almost haven't been monitoring this position, but I wonder whether there's a role for starting to question that, and starting to actually monitor that, because again, in this tipping point conversation which we were having a moment ago, I am thinking that someone who hasn't had a call from their manager in the last 2 months, we could have got away with 2 months into COVID, because obviously in a crisis, we probably could get away with in 4 months in a crisis. But actually, do we need to be starting to monitor these conversations to make sure that we are doing our best as firms to identify those people who may be excluded from the work front and decision making and everything else?
Yeah.
I wonder whether that. Yes, go on, Olivia.
Yeah,
sorry.
no, I absolutely agree with that, and I think it operates at different levels within the workplace. So, you know, at the manager level, like you say, you know, absolutely, somebody should. If somebody's got to 4 months in without being contacted by their manager, something is going seriously wrong there. Regardless, even, you know, whether it's somebody who's working or is on furlough. But then at the sort of bigger business level as well, where we're seeing the biggest success stories are where clients are moving and still continue to move to much more sort of open feedback cultures, where, you know, we're seeing more staff surveys around at the moment than you can shake a stick at. But it's absolutely crucial that there is this dialogue going on, and that this dialogue acknowledges difficulty and recognises that there isn't a single experience here. And businesses need to be thinking about, well, how can we create an opportunity for that dialogue to happen? How can we give people a voice? And whether it's, you know, for larger organisations having Pride, BAME, parents and carers, LGBTX network groups, and really thinking about how can we, in a way that works for our business, and that will be different in each case, normalise these conversations, because this has to go beyond just having, you know, those declared values and statements on our websites about commitment to diversity and inclusion. We need to make sure that our people are experiencing them in their day-to-day working reality, for those statements to be real and meaningful. And so monitoring is an absolutely fundamental part of that.
Right. So in this this kind of move from being you know, all of us, or 90%, most businesses have been encouraging these conversations to occur, encouraging managers to be more interactive with their teams and their team members, etc., to be doing that supportive role, etc. And that's a great thing, and I'm sure it's happening. But what we haven't been doing so much is monitoring that those are occurring. Now, our responsibility as HR team members and as leaders of businesses, I think after 6 months of this, starts turning to, yeah, you've encouraged people, but how are you monitoring that that's happening? How are you identifying where people are falling out of that group, etc.?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting turn in our responsibility, which is coming up right now.
I completely agree, and I think one of the problems we're seeing is, you know, there is definitely a part to play for these support groups. So, for example, a mental health support group in this Mental Health Awareness Week, but it's you know, these are isolated voices if the only people within these groups are the people who are struggling with mental health issues. You need to have these groups reaching out to the wider workforce in order for that conversation to be meaningful and for something to happen as a result of that conversation. Otherwise, they're preaching to the choir. If there isn't a sort of a wider audience.
Yes, yes. So could you tell us a bit about the role which technology can play in D&I? So how do we, what should we be thinking about from a technology perspective? Because, you know, obviously we are all now reliant more and more on technology to deliver the work we're doing. So, so what are your thoughts there, and what should we be looking out for, Olivia?
Yeah, and I'm glad our technology is holding out this morning for this session. So we're doing well
Yes.
so far. Yeah, you know, tech has been a fantastic, amazing enabler as far as D&I is concerned, and we've seen some, you know, many of our businesses and clients really accelerating digitization in a way that really benefits D&I. So a couple of the examples we've seen are clients who are now using contextual recruitment and promotion tools, whereby the tech effectively sweeps applications and positively looks for people who've had to fight harder and overcome barriers to get to where they are. So it's a sort of social mobility tool. Another example is we've seen recruitment tools, so online games where to help train managers in taking positive approaches. So it's almost like a game simulator where it takes them through a recruitment process and nudges them at touch points where, for example, unconscious bias might creep in. And I think where tech has been, well, two other areas where tech has been fantastic. First of all, it's got a real part to play in providing us with, and this goes back to your point, Tom, around how do we monitor this. Tech helps us to monitor this and to give us those data-driven insights. So I was having an interesting conversation with a client the other day who was saying, yeah, we've got the tech in to do this. We've analysed our promotion data, and you know, we were delighted to find out that women were as successful as men in being promoted. But then they discovered when they got the tech to drive down into the data that their issue was actually getting women to apply at all. They just weren't. So by using tech, they were able to identify that they had a problem with leveraging their talent pool. So that's one area where it's really useful. The other area where I think it probably really comes into its own is it's got a really fundamental part to play in the way we measure success in respect of diversity and inclusion. You know, diversity, and we have to remember they are two separate things. So diversity outcomes can be more easily measured by looking at who we have in place, so looking at the stats and looking at what measures we've put in place for those people. Whereas inclusion is a lot more difficult to measure, and that involves looking at the how for individuals. So that key question, how does it feel to work in your organization? And we need to have more than stats to be able to measure that. And sometimes there can be a real gap between the what and the who. We might be ticking the box in terms of diversity, but then falling down on the how, that the people are there, but they're not finding it's a positive experience working where they work. And tech can help here because it can ask the questions, anonymize responses, generate reports, and it's a more reliable form of collecting that data than getting people to fill out questionnaires, managers talking to them. So it's really good for that temperature checking of the workplace and measuring success.
So what you're describing to me, Olivia, is is what we as HR professionals have been doing now for the last couple of decades, really, since technology really came in, which is identify the things which we care about and which matter to our workforce, work out how to measure those things, put in place technology and other steps to be able to measure those things, and then crucially act upon those things. But what you're describing to me, which I'm really fascinated with, is that in this particular area of diversity and inclusion, there is a measurable decline in our performance in this area. And therefore, as responsible employees, etc., we actually have to accelerate that process in this area. And by the sound of it, we need to be doing that pretty much now, because this is not, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, this is not presumably the changes we've seen to these areas. There's a risk that these changes and these backward steps are going to become the new normal, because nothing's going to change. Everyone's telling us, certainly for the next weeks and months. There's already questions about the December holiday and whether that's a functional thing for many of us. And I think that a lot of forward thinkers is talking about kind of next year as well being very severely impacted. So this stuff fall in diversity and inclusion performance measures is likely to become institutionalized, because then we're talking about a year or two of allowing this to occur and not acting upon it.
Yeah. No, yeah, and it's absolutely critical, not just because there is, the real positives from having a diverse and inclusive workplace that I touched on earlier, not just because there's legal reasons why we need to do it to avoid discrimination claims, but also, we're seeing, for example, within acquisitions now, questions around D&I form part of that due diligence. So businesses are going to be really and increasingly so held to account on this front. And, when I go in and pitch to potential new clients, we are asked to describe what we're doing in respect of diversity and inclusive. And it's just a given. So it's an expectation. So without a doubt, it has a really important part to play on business agendas going forwards.
Yes, well, it's been a tough year for many areas. I've always found that getting D&I up on the agenda high enough has been a bit of a struggle, but I think the reasons you just gave us are really critical. And I think that the statistical points, which is across the whole country, that there are backward steps occurring, I think is the critical driver, which is a kind of call to action to get this back onto the agenda in a way it hasn't been for the last 6 months, or has been, but not formalized, shall we say.
Just a small anecdote, acting for a business looking to acquire somebody else within their sector. I can't obviously name names, but we asked the question around what they were doing in respect of D&I, and their answer, literally, it was one bullet point, and it said, "We have an equal opportunities policy." And that was it. And that was a really, really fundamental sticking point for our client, because now, businesses are really concerned about culture and fit of businesses they're acquiring. And they saw that as being a real stumbling block to being able to absorb and work alongside that business, because that was in stark contrast to all the measures which our client was taking in respect of D&I. And it was an area that they went straight back and were saying, come on, there must be more than this. But sadly not. But it did impact and stall that whole acquisition process.
And presumably the right answer would have been that we had a policy which we were enacting pre the change in work, which has occurred over the last 6 months. We revisited that, looked at it again in light of the way our business is now working, which is very different from that. And we have put in place measures tools, etc., to measure our success against it. But the right answer would have been all three of those things, because actually simply doing the same kind of measures, the same kind of controls on this stuff, which we had 6 months ago, simply ain't going to work.
No.
Our way of working's changed. So you need all three things. And I think that's kind of like that's my takeaway, really, from our conversation so far, that there is an urgent need for businesses to revisit their strategy in terms of diversity and inclusion in light of the changes to which we are working and the overall decline, and that needs to be an active revisit of that policy and procedure with measures to make sure that it's enacted. And I think that's a very good measure. Or you ain't going to get bought, or you're not going to be able to sell anybody, or your business is going to be in a mess, as the example you described.
Yeah, and I don't want to sort of undermine the importance of policy. I spend a lot of my time drafting policies and these statements, and they are important, but I see those as being the talk, if you like, but what's more important is how we walk the talk, and that comes down to those practical measures that we are putting in place, and showing that, the starting point is being able to show that we've looked into and we understand those experiences of difference that we touched on at the beginning of this session, that we've spoken on an individual level to our people, and then being able to respond to the feedback and put in practical measures to deal with that. And then we're measuring outcomes as well. So it's kind of that full journey.
Absolutely. And that gets us, Olivia, to a position of being okay. And that's that kind of, we've sorted out that stuff. But as you mentioned, we started this conversation talking about the positive benefits. So it's not just a question, this is the opportunity of being able to drive greater diversity and inclusion, which sits within this change to work, which, as well as making us good employers and all that, also unlocks an enormous amount of potential, I believe, which actually the switch in ways of working allows.
Yeah.
You were describing, for example, people who have significant care roles, etc., and many of those people pre moving online to work were entirely excluded from the workforce and their ability. And unlocking their potential is something which is new with this change of work, I think. So if someone has, 4 hours in the middle of the day in which they are able to be economically active, then they can do that now in many of our businesses in a way in which previously that would not have been a possible thing to tap into, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and I think just as a sort of practical point for businesses to think about is, you were talking about measuring and monitoring, is that how are we going to do that to measure outcomes, and how are we going to hold ourselves accountable here? One way of doing this, and there's many different ways, but one way is to actually make external commitments. So, for example, there's the Race at Work Charter, the Race Fairness Commitment, where, and we've signed up to this, where actually we as a firm commit to taking specific action. And if you go on their websites, you can see lists of the actions that we've signed up for, and that we will then in a year's time measure ourselves against those outcomes. So it is that external commitment, and commitment to our people as well, so they can see what is being done on this front.
Amazing. Yeah, really interesting. So at this point, we're 40 minutes in. So Zoe, can I ask you what are the questions which come in, so that Olivia and I can do our best to kind of address those?
Yeah, so one question for Olivia. From a D&I point of view, what is your business doing to support the well-being and the mental health of your team, especially during COVID-19?
Great question, on the spot, Olivia.
Really, really good. Yeah, I love that. I bet that was someone from OC who's actually listening in and just wanted to put me on the spot. Actually, it's a really, it's a great time to ask that question, because it is Mental Health Awareness Week. So just yesterday, I was speaking on a panel event within OC where we had 10 speakers all talking about how their own characteristics. So mine were looking at mental health from the perspective of being a working mother and a mother of adopted children, and talking about our realities and experiences in respect to mental health. And that group is led by one of our senior corporate partners. So a really powerful voice in terms of him basically telling his story and saying it is okay not to feel okay. So we have those support groups and those sort of events. Really importantly, there's lots we've done, but I think probably what's worked particularly well is not just having these support groups, but also underpinning the support groups with an ally system, which is other people who don't sit within those particular groups, but are part of a wider ally network, and arming those allies with the information and the knowledge about other people's experiences, so that they have the language and skills to be able to speak to those individuals, and for those individuals to the wider workforce as well. So going back to a point we covered earlier, Tom, so that these are not just isolated silos, but it is a dialogue amongst the whole of our firm.
That is interesting. And there has been a second question. If you're a small business with very limited additional budget and no D&I manager, what would you recommend for D&I on a shoestring?
Good question, and I'm writing it down because we're a smaller business in brand performance, so I'm going to do whatever you say, Olivia.
Yeah. And I do know it's very different where, like say for us, we have a D&I, somebody who's sort of, this is their remit, so it's their day-to-day job. It's a lot harder where it's sort of part and parcel of everything else you have to deal with. But there, I think it is, what's really important is looking at people's day-to-day realities and day-to-day experiences, and going back to just those simple steps of, we can still, no matter what the size of our business is, talk to our people. That's kind of the critical piece, is keeping those lines of communication open, and thinking about how can we still encourage people from all of these different groups to come forward and talk. It can be more on an individual level about their experiences, and there still needs to be, responsibility even within a small business for D&I should still sit somewhere. So then that person should be looking at, for example, okay, we're now all working on Zoom. How does that impact on any employees we have who say suffer with autism or ADHD? What can we put in place inclusion protocols around the use of Zoom, which is something a lot of our smaller clients are doing, just to make sure people are included. So there are still lots of things we can do, but I do appreciate it. It can be difficult.
I see. So the key takeaway, I mean, I imagine that the corporate partner you were talking about has another job to do as well as work on this. But
absolutely. Yeah.
But you're basically advising us to do the same thing, which is to take one of our senior leaders, even in a smaller firm, and then appoint them with this role such that it gets the attention as in addition to their other roles, but start getting it onto the agenda that way. And even in small firms, we can do that quite easily.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of voice from the top is the most powerful one. And we had lots of emails after our event earlier in the week on an individual basis of people saying it was so refreshing hearing these people as senior people within our business speak and share their individual experiences, that it almost just was the key that unlocked the door for others to be able to come forward and say, I'm actually in the same boat. Can I just speak about this? And I think that is a start. There's a lot more we can do, but that I think on an individual level is the most important piece.
Well, I like it because it can be applied to companies of any size, and therefore
absolutely, yeah.
Advice. Okay, well, look, it's 1:45, so thank you everybody for joining us. My key takeaway, which I mentioned earlier, is that it strikes me that after 6 months and more of the most significant change to work we have seen over the last 20, 30, whatever number of years, that actually starting to formalize, starting to monitor these things is becoming absolutely critical. This is now, after 6 months, becoming a way of life rather than a short-term crisis which we're getting through. Many of the changes which we're seeing are here for good, but what we've got to do is start formalizing and thinking about how to measure these and drive these agendas, the agenda of diversity, inclusion, and other related agendas, and actually start thinking about them as a priority, because the world has changed, and we need to be revisiting all our policies and procedures and how those things work right now. So, Olivia, that was a really good call to action today. Thank you very much for your time. That was brilliant insights and really useful.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Tom. I've really enjoyed it.
And then thank you, everybody, for attending today and taking time out of your busy agenda. That was really useful. It was great to be able to focus on this area today, which we have been talking about for some time. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all on our next webinar, where we'll be looking at a different area of the impact of COVID. So thank you very much and have a great working day. Thank you.
Thank you.